Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Sika. Well, the UN and Arab League Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi is in Damascus to persuade President Bashar al-Assad to comply with a 4-day truce. He's proposing it begin during the Muslim holiday of al-Adha on October 26. Brahimi's call has drawn growing regional and international support, including from Turkey and Assad's main supporter, Iran. Brahimi believes a temporary truce could pave the way for a political solution to Syria's 20-month-long conflict. We'll talk about all that in just a moment, but first, here's Gerald Tan.
Negotiating a ceasefire, the UN Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi begins a round of talks in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The veteran diplomat is trying to secure a temporary pause in the fighting just for 4 days during an important Muslim holiday next week.
We have talked about the importance of de-escalating the violence and whether it would be possible for the occasion of Eid al-Adha. The fighting would stop completely. We will discuss this and the Syrian situation in general.
Yet, even a short-term humanitarian truce might be difficult to put in place. Activists are reporting sustained aerial bombardment by government troops across Syria's north. Rebel fighters say they'll put down their guns only if the regime does the same. Western and regional powers, including Iran and Turkey, have thrown their support behind the effort.
I call on all of those fighting in Syria to temporarily cease hostilities during Eid al-Adha, and if possible to also aim for a truce lasting beyond the holiday.
We've been here before. Previous ceasefires have been agreed to and then ignored. One in April collapsed after a few days, subsequently leading to the resignation of Brahimi's predecessor, Kofi Annan. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since the start of the Syrian uprising last year. Brahimi's plan for a break in the violence may just provide some hope to civilians waiting for a definitive end to the war. Gerald Tan for Inside Syria.
Well, joining us now to discuss the situation in Syria are our three guests. In Birmingham, Malik al-Abdah, a pro-opposition Syrian journalist. In Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift, a fellow at the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia. Mr. Swift is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Fighting Vanguard, Local Insurgencies in the Global Jihad. And here in the studio in Doha, we're joined by Salman Shaikh. He's the director of the Brookings Doha Center and has just written a report called Losing Syria and How to Avoid It. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Salman Shaikh, you're sitting right here, so I might as well start with you. Is this, in your view, a plan that can work?
No, I don't think so. We all, of course, hope that the killing will stop. Syrians, civilians have suffered too much, and even the last few days we've had over 200 people killed every day. But we have to notice that there is really no agreement even on how you begin a political process at this point in time. And so trying to put some sort of a truce in that leads to a more expanded political process, I think, is totally unrealistic at this point in time.
Malik al-Abdah, I want to ask you about the opposition forces, because at this point, and this includes the Free Syrian Army, they are relatively weak, they are fragmented, they're still not a cohesive unit. What position are they in, not only to accept a ceasefire, but to negotiate as one unit?
Well, first of all, let's split the opposition between the armed opposition and the political opposition. The main body in the political opposition is still the Syrian National Council, and they have voiced their support for Lakhdar Brahimi's ceasefire proposal. So they're supportive of it, even though they've done so, they've underreported their acceptance because they know this is going to be controversial in the street, especially those who are supportive of the opposition. The armed opposition, the FSA and allied groups, there are probably over 100, at least 100 armed groups in Syria. They have said that they might accept this proposal on certain conditions, such as the lifting of the siege on Homs and Bashar al-Assad not using this truce as a way of bolstering his army and repositioning his army in a way that they can actually carry out an offensive after Eid al-Adha. So the armed opposition is willing to accept this, I think, but with certain conditions.
Christopher Swift, the point was made in Gerald's report there that we just heard that other ceasefires have come and gone with neither side honouring them. What confidence is there that Lakhdar Brahimi is going to succeed this time when all the attempts of his predecessor Kofi Annan have failed?
Unfortunately, I don't have very much confidence in the Brahimi initiative, and I wish that wasn't the case. Look, in a conflict, people agree to a ceasefire for two reasons. The first is they're compelled to do it, either by their own circumstances, or they're losing the war, or they're forced by an outside actor, be it the international community or some other group, to agree to a ceasefire, or they choose to do it of their own volition, either because they're worried about international public opinion, or they need time to regroup, or they themselves feel like it's time to start a negotiation. In the case of the Assad regime, we've seen no evidence that the international community is going to compel a ceasefire or compel very much aside from the sanctions that we've placed on the regime. And in the case of choosing a ceasefire, look, the opposition in Syria is so fragmented and so decentralized that a small group of people could very easily spoil whatever ceasefire is put in place. And we've seen that in the past on both sides, both with the Assad regime and with certain factions within the resistance. It's a very, very complicated situation. The one thing that I think Mr. Brahimi is doing properly is emphasizing the need to de-escalate the violence. We've seen shelling on the Turkish border in recent weeks. We've seen shelling on the Iraqi border just in the last few days. Syria is the place where all the ethnicities and religious traditions in the greater Middle East sort of wrap together like the spokes on a pinwheel. And if something isn't done to de-escalate the violence, then we're going to see a much more complicated regional situation very soon.
Salman Shaikh, I want to ask you what you read into the fact that Lakhdar Brahimi has chosen to point to Eid al-Adha and this Muslim holiday as an occasion to try to begin some sort of a ceasefire. It's an occasion for Muslims of all corners of the faith to observe, whether they're, regardless of their ethnicity or their politics, be they Sunni or Shia. Can this occasion be used then to force both sides to, if nothing else, reevaluate the whole situation?
Well, he's looking for a humanitarian gesture. He's looking for one from the regime as well as the fighting groups on the ground. And in that respect, yes, it's clever in trying to use whatever tools you can in a desperate situation. But again, I would say that there really isn't a pathway to a lasting truce. It may be that this period is used, if we do get some sort of calm, to reorganize and resupply, both in terms of the opposition sides as well as with regards to the regime. One point on the region, and more broadly, we have heard Lakhdar Brahimi go to a number of capitals recently, including Tehran, as well as in Turkey, and getting support for some sort of a humanitarian ceasefire. So I think there is a certain amount of desperation here in the situation. As has been pointed out, the regional situation in particular is becoming extremely difficult now. So that may all these factors may collude for some sort of a truce over the next 2-3 days, but this is not going to last if it takes hold in any case.
Christopher Swift, what's your view on this? I saw you nodding in agreement to some of what Salman just said there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that the danger here is that if there is a truce, it's used predominantly to regroup and resupply. Look, this is a very nasty civil war, and the civil war that it reminds me the most of is the Bosnian civil war from the early to mid-90s. And every time we had a truce or a ceasefire in that particular instance, both sides, it didn't matter whether they were Bosnian or Serb or Croat, would use that opportunity to resupply, to regroup, to reorganize, you know, to basically tend to their own wounds and then get ready for the next round of the fight. The civil war in Syria has now, at least for the regime, reached an existential level. And until that existential concern can be taken off the table for them in some way, I don't see any reason why they would stop fighting until they're forced to. And that really calls for more intervention on the part of the international community, especially as the regional situation starts to get implicated in some very disturbing ways.
Do you see it that way, Malik al-Abdah, that this will just be seen as an opportunity for both sides to regroup rather than commit to any lasting ceasefire?
Well, I think it would be very natural for armies, armed groups, insurgents, and the Syrian military to use that truce, if it actually takes place, to use that truce to resupply and you know, reposition their forces, for the second round. This is very normal. But I think what Lakhdar Brahimi is trying to establish here is, let's say, some hope for Syria. Because at the moment, there is no common ground whatsoever between the regime and the opposition forces. And if you can at least get them to agree on a common ground that peace for a few days at least is a good thing, then perhaps you can get them to agree on other things as well. So it's about finding hope, because at the moment the situation is it's desperate and it's hopeless. And it's a very difficult task, but I think it has to be done. And I think Lakhdar Brahimi has the experience. He's was instrumental in the Taif agreement in 1989, which ended the Lebanese civil war. Obviously, the situation is different in Syria, but it's not all that different. So perhaps, I mean, Lakhdar Brahimi is probably the most qualified for the job. And I think people inside Syria, the civilians, are hoping at least that they will get a few days of peace.
Salman Shaikh, when you look at Lakhdar Brahimi, does he in some ways have a little bit more of an advantage over Kofi Annan in that, first of all, the expectations perhaps won't be as high, the fact that he is an Arab speaker, he's from the region, he has a personal connection to the royal family in Jordan. Could all of those things work in his favour?
Well, to a certain degree, yes. And of course, I've worked with Lakhdar Brahimi. Lakhdar Brahimi is a very skillful and diplomat and a very respected figure in the Arab world and internationally. But like Kofi Annan, he faces mission impossible. The problem here is it's not Lakhdar Brahimi or Kofi Annan. The problem is the model of Lakhdar Brahimi and Kofi Annan, where you're trying to negotiate some sort of a political solution with a regime which refuses to stop killing its people. And until we can find another way to fashion a political solution, which I would say binds Syrians together rather than Syrians with the regime, I'm afraid we're not going to make progress. And this is why Lakhdar Brahimi faces such a difficult choice. Going back to Damascus, shaking hands with leaders who are now unrelentingly continuing killing their people is a very difficult.
What do you think he should be
proposition.
telling them as he meets with them this Saturday?
Well, I think we need a completely different approach. I think we need a much more muscular diplomacy by those who are willing to put much more pressure on the Assad regime, and those who are not should be told that we're going to take a much more muscular position. And in this respect, I think the relative passivity of the international community, including the United States, has led to a situation whereby which Assad and his regime feel that they have a license to kill, and they've continued in that respect.
Yeah, I want to put that to you, Christopher Swift. The difficulty of negotiations is certainly very high after all of the violence that we've seen. This is not a regime that anyone, least of all the opposition, wants to do business with. Isn't that part of the problem here?
Yeah, that is part of the problem. Look, part of what makes this Mr. Brahimi's mission impossible, as my colleague in Doha noted, is not just the difficulty of dealing with the regime, but the difficulty of being the spokesperson for the United Nations and to an equal extent the Arab League. The Arab League may be of one mind about the situation in Syria, but the United Nations, and especially the United Nations Security Council, is not. You know, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with his European Union counterparts earlier this week to discuss some sort of way forward in terms of, you know, an international position on Syria, something more productive. The Europeans just imposed another round of sanctions, but as Foreign Minister, the British Foreign Minister noted, you know, there was a lot of discussion with his Russian counterpart, but there was no progress. There was no agreement. So the difficulty Dr. Brahimi has is representing an institution that is itself not in agreement. So, you know, there's a lot to be said for maintaining hope, maintaining the dialogue, keeping these channels open. And I think Mr. Brahimi is doing that and doing that as effectively as anyone could under these circumstances. But absent a change in the structure of the institution or absent a change in the mood or current posture of the international community, I think we're going to see events on the ground unfold much as they have the last 20 months.
Malik al-Abdah, I want to ask you that same question, but I want to turn it on its head if I can. Because there's so much blood that has been shed, the only way to stop it is to keep talking. What else can you do?
Well, I mean, so far there hasn't been any negotiations between the opposition and the regime, and I think at the moment, in the short term at least, it's highly unlikely it's going to take place. I think what the regime wants is a multilateral approach where the regime and the opposition, but also countries like Russia and Iran, Egypt also, those countries sit together and hammer out some sort of Taif-type agreement which ended the Lebanese civil war. I think that model now, I think Lakhdar Brahimi is pushing for, but also Russia also wants this model, Iran wants this model. So this model is probably going to be the outline of any peace agreement in Syria, because simply having dialogue or negotiations between the opposition and the regime, I think it's no longer about the opposition and the regime. I think it's a wider game. There are regional powers who have a stake in the conflict. There are international powers who have a stake in the conflict. So it's no longer a question of democracy in Syria or not having democracy, or alleviating some of the economic demands that people inside the country have. For example, I don't think it's necessarily that's necessarily the issue. I think it's more of guaranteeing rights for minority groups in the country who form the backbone of support for Bashar al-Assad. Those people want international guarantees that they will not be persecuted, that their economic interests will not be harmed in a future Syria. And I think that has to be the framework for any negotiated settlement.
Do you share that view, Salman Shaikh?
Up to a point, I agree with Malik here. For sure, we need to ensure that all Syrians are bound into a political solution. And the challenge here, and something that the political opposition has not yet achieved, is to bring in the Alawi community, which is dissatisfied increasingly, I think elements are, with what the Assad family and its supporters have been doing. But I think we have to warn against a Taif or an Iraq-style deal. Let's look at Iraq today. Let's look at Lebanon. Where did those deals get us? Those countries are not stable. It would be a tragedy, in my view, if a political solution on Syria rested with regards to the regional powers coming together and making some sort of a balance of forces of different sectarian groups inside Syria. Syria
each carving out their own patch.
That's right. Syria is not that. Syria is a different kind of country in that respect, with a very proud tradition of peaceful coexistence between its people. And if we get some sort of a national pact that solidifies a sectarian solution, I personally, and I think many Syrians, would be very, very sad for that. It is clear that I think Lakhdar is looking to the Iranians in particular to help fashion some sort of a deal where he can start moving on a transition. And I think that's where Lakhdar Brahimi could prove to be extremely useful in trying to shape a transition. But I hope that transition is not based on sectarian lines.
Well, you talked earlier about the need for a more robust diplomatic approach internationally. And you talked about these sectarian issues. Maybe that's why, I mean, I would put it to you, maybe that's why the international community has been so reluctant to wade further into this, is because they don't want to provoke those sectarian tensions further.
Yes, but don't get me started on the international community. The international community...
Maybe I do want to get you started on it.
Well, the international community has buried its head in the sand for the last 20 months, whilst we've seen the slaughter of people intensify. Well, you can't bury your head in the sand because the ground starts to shake underneath you. And that is what is going on around the region now. And yes, first and foremost, we have to look to the divisions within the UN Security Council. And it's very unfortunate that the great powers, Russia and China, have not come in as part of a consensus that means we have to start a transition. And we are now in a situation whereby which we're seeing increasing sectarian conflict, not just in Syria, but throughout the region. It's almost as if the Syrian fault line is where the great power rivalries which have come up, where the Arab awakenings, and now where the sectarian, the bubbling sectarian tensions, especially since Iraq, have all come together. This is a very, very dangerous situation in that respect.
Christopher Swift, I know we've come back to this issue before, but as long as we have two permanent members of the Security Council in Russia and China continuing to block any efforts at sanctions against the Syrian regime, what hope is there for any progress on this?
You know, if you had asked me that question 6 months or 9 months ago, I would have said it's absolutely crucial to have the Russians and the Chinese at the table as part of the process, as responsible actors and great powers in international affairs. Both of these countries have a substantial interest in the outcome. Both of these countries have a substantial interest in a Middle East and in a Syria that is stable, prosperous, and has a legitimate government. The difficulty here is that both Moscow and Beijing have attached themselves to an aberration in Syrian history, to this particular regime in Damascus, rather than looking at the history that Syria has had of relative tolerance, of a lot of dynamism. We're looking at a highly educated population that's economically very viable. You know, so Syria, before the war, if this had been managed in a more constructive way, could have been a very, very exciting place. Because it's been managed in a destructive way, because, you know, not only people in Syria, but because Moscow and Beijing have attached themselves to this aberrant regime, it's all broken apart. One of the concerns I have moving forward, and it was alluded to earlier in the discussion, is the difference between freezing the current equilibrium, which is something we've seen happen in Iraq, we've seen it happen in Lebanon, we saw it happen in Bosnia, let's not forget Bosnia, and establishing a new equilibrium. And for the near term, diplomacy is going to focus on freezing the current equilibrium just to stop the bloodletting, which is very, very important. But my colleagues are absolutely right, but that we have to be thinking more creatively. We have to be thinking more towards the future. And that's going to require a new equilibrium. It's going to require guarantees for some of the minority groups. It's going to require, you know, the kinds of systems where people can express themselves and their aspirations politically and economically without fear of retribution. It's going to require a strong rule of law, and it's going to require that all of those things be authentically Syrian and not imposed from the outside. That's a tremendous amount of work, and the simple fact is we can't do it. The international community can't do it by remote control. We've got to get in there. We've got to have a more active role. Mr. Brahimi is making some of that space right now. But the lockup in the Security Council is the major issue right now. And absent that changing, I think you're going to see a much more aggressive posture from the United States and from Western Europe, especially after the U.S. presidential elections.
Malik al-Abdah, as long as there isn't any concerted action coming from the international community, from the UN Security Council more specifically, how do you see this going forward then?
Well, the United States and the West generally have always lacked leverage over Syria, because Syria does little trade with the United States, and the United States really has struggled historically to apply pressure on Bashar al-Assad. So what's actually happening now is nothing new. It's been going on for since Bashar al-Assad assumed power, and even in the days of his father. So the West have a problem with leverage on Bashar, and historically they've relied on countries like Russia and Turkey to temper Syrian action. So it's very normal that the United States would not be in a position to dictate terms or apply real pressure on Bashar al-Assad short of military action. And I've heard it said from a regime supporter that only God and America can bring down the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Well, he's right, but America can only bring it down through a military force, something which President Obama has resisted, and perhaps quite rightly so, because after the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which will happen within a space of years, I don't think President Obama wants U.S. troops or the U.S. military to be involved in a new adventure. I think nothing will be resolved through violence in Syria. That's the unfortunate fact. People are dying on a daily basis for very little, actually. So we need to talk. There needs to be peace, and I think Lakhdar Brahimi should be fully supported by all international actors.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. I want to thank all three of our guests for joining us this week. In Birmingham, Malik al-Abdah; in Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift; and here in the studio, Salman Shaikh. And thank you for watching. Remember, our Syrian coverage continues 24 hours a day on our website, al-Jazeera.com. There you can find this program if you want to watch it again. For everyone here, I'm Hazem Sika. Bye for now.